Welcome to DIY Easy Crafts and Berg knifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at PlantStone knife scales by Mental Co. Now, this project started, I was working on a full blade etched deer in the woods, it's actually by a lake, knife, chef knife, and I wanted something a little bit different for the knife scales, kind of unique and something that would fit the theme of this particular blade. I went on to Robert Belcher's website, Mental Co., and I found some scales that he calls PlantStone. Now, searching through what was available under that category, under the PlantStone category, I found what he calls Forest Floor. And these scales are definitely unique. They really kind of caught my eye, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Now, the scale material is all listed on Rob's website, and these are cast in resin. So it'll be interesting to see how these come out, how they polish up, and how they look as a finished product. So the first thing I did was I glued black liners onto the back of each scale. I did this with 2-part epoxy, 24-hour 2-part epoxy, roughed up the side of the scale that I wanted to glue to, cleaned it off with alcohol, glued it with the 2-part epoxy. Then I just went over to the bandsaw and trimmed off the excess material. The next step is to shape the very front of the scales. And I'm going to run through a few belts on this. I basically roughed them to shape with a 60 grit. Then I finished them with an 80 and a 120, and I think I went to a 240, a 400, and an 800. So quite a few belt changes. And the reason for this is not only do you want to shape the front of the scales, but you also want to polish them before you mount the scales to the handles. Now, polishing the scales, or the front end of the scales before you mount them is really important because once they're mounted, it's almost impossible to get at the very front of the scales to polish them. Much easier to do before they're mounted. Now, I just used a felt belt and a little polishing compound, and I was very surprised at how easily this PlantStone material not only sanded, but also polished. So this is how I mount knife scales. It's certainly not the only way. I mount one side at a time, position it, clamp it, let it dry. Then I drill holes using the pre-drilled holes through the knife blank kind of as a drill guide. I use a 2-part epoxy. This is a 2-ton 24-hour cure epoxy. I position the scale exactly where I want it on the blank, and then I'll clamp that into position. Now note that I don't tape the blades up to prevent glue from getting on them. What I do is I just do a little cleanup afterwards. It's just a personal preference. Now, sometimes when clamping, that blade will move a little bit. Make sure it stays where you want it. I clean off the little joint in between the handle and the blade just with a piece of paper towel, and then a moistened paper towel in alcohol, and that gets rid of all the excess glue. And then I take a really good look at the blade and wipe off any little smudges of glue that I find with that alcohol dampened paper towel. Then I set that side aside to dry. Once it's dry and cured, I'll use the flat surface of the scales, go over to my drill press. I'm using a backer board, it's just a flat piece of pine, and I'll use the pre-drilled holes through the handle as my guide to drill the pinholes. So now I've got one side of the scales mounted, glued, and holes through them. I can trim off the excess material either on a bandsaw or a pin saw. That's really the first indication of what the finished product is going to look like. And now I'm just going to go back and repeat those steps. I'm going to mark where exactly I want that second set of scales to end up being. I've prepped the back of the scales. I've sanded them off, cleaned them with alcohol, did the same thing with the knife blank. I'm adding the 2-part epoxy, not only to the handle material, but also to the blank. And then I'm going to position that second side of the plant stone scales. Try to get it perfectly aligned so that the curvature, the front end of the scales matches perfectly with the curvature from the first side, which is already glued in place. And then I'm just going to clamp this into position. And I'll repeat the cleaning process, that little joint with a paper towel, scrape off as much of the bulk, clean it with a dampened paper towel with alcohol, and then clean off any excess glue that's on the blade. Much easier to clean it now than try to get it off after it's been hardened. Then I'm going to go back to the drill press. Again, I'm using that backer board to prevent any blowout on the back side. I'm going to drill through the existing holes through side number 1 and also through the blank, so that the end result is I'm getting holes that are perfectly aligned right through all 3 pieces. And I'm ending up with the scales glued in place exactly where I want them on the blank. So like I said, it's not the fastest way of mounting scales. It's just my preferred method. So now I've got both sides of the scales with holes. I'm going to trim off the excess material on a bandsaw. This plant stone material cuts very nicely, equivalent of cutting wood. Then I'm going to go over to the 2x72. Using a 90-degree work table, I'm going to profile the knife handle material or the plant stone material so that it matches up with the tang of the blank, so that the metal is exposed on the tang. Just trim off as much of that plant stone as needed. I'm using a coarse grit belt for this. I think it's a number 60 grit. Then I'm going to sand vertically. And what I'm going to do is, because the plant stone comes a little thicker than I want the finished handles to be, I'm going to take them down in the width. So I'm going to just sand it till I've got the width of each side where I want them. And usually I want those scales to be about 1/4 inch thick as a finished product. At the same time, I've already glued the stainless steel pins in place. I'm also sanding down those pins at the same time. Frequent cooling, and then once they're down to the width that I like, I'm going to use that same 2x72 belt sander with an 80 grit paper to start to roll over that top edge of the scales, to round over that top edge. You have to be real careful. You don't want to touch the blade to the belt, of course. You don't want to damage the blade. But the 2x72 is just a great tool. I try to do the majority of the work on that rather than taking out the Dremel grinder or any other tools. And I do this with an 80 grit, and then I go back over it with 120 grit. Get it nice and comfortable in the hand. Now I use an oscillating sander to shape the inside curve of the handles. And I'll use this with an 80 grit and I think it's a 220 or 240. It's the only two grits that are available at the local Home Depot. So I'll smooth out the majority of the handles, get them nice and comfortable in my hand. And so far, I'm pretty impressed with how this plant stone is holding up and sanding. The next step, of course, is hand sanding. And there really is no other way of doing it to get the good results. Now, I hand sand with a 500, a 1,000, a 1,500, and then real quick with a 2,000. And hand sanding down to that 2,000 grit really makes a difference when trying to polish almost any cast scales. It takes a little bit of time, but the end results are well worth it. Now, after the hand sanding, you can either go to a buffing wheel, or you can go back to the 2x72 like I do with a felt buffing belt and polishing compound. Either way, the end result is pretty much the same. You can actually, a lot of times I'll use a combination of both. So this is the felt belt. A particular 2x72 that I use is an Origin blade maker, an OBM. It's 2 horsepower variable speed. The variable speed really comes in handy. And very quickly, that PlantStone material polishes up. Now, it doesn't polish the real high gloss that some other cast resin scales do, but that's not really what I was looking for in these scales. You know, this is a woods or a forest themed blade. What I really wanted to do is just be able to see all of the insides of those that scale material, you know, the little pieces of root material and whatever other greenery he's got in there. And this is the finished product. So if you're interested in any of these full blade edged knives, etched knives, by all means, take a look at my site, Berg, knifemaking.com. If you're interested in these PlantStone scales, I highly recommend them, and I get those from Mental Co. at myshop.com. And these particular ones were the PlantStone Forest Floor scales. Thank you for watching the episode. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. By all means, check us out on the web at DIY Easy Crafts and bergknifemaking.com, and join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. Thank you very much.